These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. My friends, welcome back. This is These Small Hours podcast. I am Russell Cordell Staker. What follows is the fifth segment to my novella, In These Small Hours. There will be one further segment, which I'll release shortly after. This one is put out, which is going to include the afterword to the novella. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy. Dad was walking out to Polar Bear under the carport toting his makeshift RC tackle box when I pulled into the parking lot. I could see the red handle of the rubber propeller spinner hanging out over the side. He was wearing a white button-down Magellan fishing shirt with striker, custom stenciled in royal blue across the back and also on the front left pocket. I shook my head and laughed. I'd been telling Dad for years he was the Laverne to my Shirley. "Morning, Dad. Where's my shirt? I didn't get you one. And why is that? Because only one of us can look this cool on fly day. You're a piece of work," Dad winked. We loaded GB and the old igloo cooler packed with sandwiches and banquet beer into the truck. We'd get the rest at Smith's. "Let's roll," said Dad. We drove to McDonald's. Rachel was already there with the kids, and we walked in together for a fly day pancake breakfast, and after to Smith's Food and Drug to make short work of the only aisles that counted. Then we drove to the field on the west side of the Salt Lake landfill. It was good to see the Screamin' Ute Aviators RC Club logo on the old board as we pulled up to the gravel lot and got out to unload. The cool of the fall morning gave way to the warm sun shining brightly above us. There were a few old-timers with planes puttering about, but I didn't recognize any of them. One of the guys came over to say hello, but we didn't know his name. After greeting us, he ambled over to his patch of concrete under the hangar to fiddle with a prop. I thought about old Jerry and the freshly lit cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth. It would have been pretty to hear the sound of his ragged voice one more time. Dad coordinated the setup with the kids, and I stood back with Rachel to watch. He was in his element. He wired up the engine block to the battery and set the rubber spinner to the nose prop and gave it a jolt. The spinner, with its peculiar thud-rubbing sound, turned the propeller hard, transforming it into a translucent disc whirring in front of an alto-throated OS engine as it came fully alive. Dad waved at me to unplug the wires on the engine block, which I did, and then Dad took the plane from behind at the wings and brought it upright into the air. Parallel to his chest, his arms extended shoulder wide to feel the lift from the engine and across the wings. Dad's face was puckered up in that old familiar concentrated way. He wore his baseball cap backwards, and his gas station sunglasses hung halfway down the bridge of his nose. He was older now, but in so many ways just as young as I remembered him. His pants hung off his hips and buttocks and gathered in a bunch at his ankles. Dad never did have much of an ass, and it always made his pants hang like a sheet dangling over a cliff's edge. In spite of this, Dad truly was a specimen of a man. Though life had withered his stature and cheeseburgers shaped his paunch, I still saw a little of the Sundance Kid in him. Dad set the plane back on its wheels and signaled me to taxi. I acknowledged and rolled the plane forward and then brought it around to a full stop at the head of the strip, and waited until Dad got over to me for the handoff. He lifted the radio from my hands and put the strap over his head and around his neck and smiled. Then he gunned the plane, and off it went down the bumpy strip and soon thereafter took flight. The plane disappeared into the white glare of the sun. I squinted and then looked down to see Dad looking up. GB, with its stout torso, flew exceptionally well. There was nothing timid about that plane. It cut and bobbed like a sea lion in liquid air. I tracked the plane along a canvas of blue. On it went, farther and farther, until it was just a little pale dot in the sky. Dad took it higher, and I listened for the variance in its whiny pitch as it dropped into a slow barrel roll, and then he leveled it out. "Wow," I said, hearing Bill's voice in the timbre of my own. "You come and fly it," Dad shouted, and without hesitating he lifted the lanyard from his neck and handed me the radio. It felt good to fly again. "Go, hot dog, go," he said. After a good long fly, the gas began running low. We could hear the engine sputtering and catching a bit, and Dad stepped in to gradually help with radio control. The light of morning was now at its highest point, just short of itself in that yawning plainness of fall, where shadows persist in open space unlike any other time of the year. Dad said softly, "Let's bring GB home." I handed Dad the radio, and he took over. The plane immediately responded and began a sloping descent through a long and wide half-circle turn, moving from our right to our left. He brought it around and then leveled it out parallel to our position, now moving from our left toward the strip through to our right. My daughter Lily came up and stood next to Dad as he lined up the approach with the flaps down in the soft and cool air. Dad set his legs as he angled GB's cherry red nose up, its prop moving so elegantly it appeared as if it were rotating in reverse, and there at a point of grace and physics it appeared to stall before he set itself gingerly onto the tarmac with a gentle bounce of its rubber wheels on the black asphalt. It torqued just a little and bounced again, and then rolled confidently on by us to the other end of the strip, and there came to a complete stop. "Hot damn," said Dad. We all cheered. I took Dad home in Polar Bear. He sat quietly looking out the window as the sky was beginning to fade from yellow to orange. It had been a fine fly day. We both knew it. Dad was satisfied, but I could see he was tired. His vibrant nature was waning a little, and he seemed to drift off to a faraway place somewhere in his mind. I watched him look out over the road and beyond to the green grass of the field as it rolled by along an unobstructed horizon laid bare before us. After a little while, I put on the Beach Boys. We sat and listened to Carl Wilson's mellow, soft tenor give voice to the song, God Only Knows. The song filled the space of that truck with all that was good in our lives, and something of the unknown just out in front of us as we kept rolling onward toward it. We were nearing the train tracks out along the empty stretch of 5600 West, where to our right was a conglomeration of dilapidated shipping cargo containers that for years had been stacked out in front of an old warehouse. And there, penned behind a makeshift wire fence about 30 yards wide, was a lonely white horse I'd passed on many occasions. I'd wondered about the horse and its unknown owner. We somehow felt it appropriate to pen a beast at the side of such an ugly stretch of road. Dad put his hand on my knee and said, "Hey, Rance, pull up on that shoulder there, and let's get out and see that old Bronco." I wasn't expecting that. We got out of the truck. Dad stepped to the rear and opened up the igloo cooler. He reached inside and came up with the biggest goddamn red apple I'd ever seen and nodded his head for me to follow him over. Dad was a little unsteady on his feet as I came up on him, so I leaned into him a bit because I thought he was listing, but he nimbly righted himself without my aid. "Heavy apple," he said. As we got to the wire fence, he lifted the apple out to the horse, who by now had his backside turned to us, with his head far down into a filthy white bathtub situated up against a faded blue Maersk cargo container. "Hey, horsey," Dad said. "Got a little something here for you." The horse didn't move. We stood there for several minutes. A steady flow of cars whipped by. I felt a little self-conscious and turned back for the truck. That's when Dad said, "Usually he comes right out and eats the apple from my hand." Even now, the simplicity of insight in the sentence Dad spoke astonishes me. I shouldn't have been so surprised by what I heard, but I was. It stopped me. I turned back and saw Dad kneel and place the apple just under the wire fence on the ground for the old horse to come and eat after we had gone. Dad rose up and dusted off his pants and then started back my way. There in plain light along the shoulder of an ugly little road in the middle of nowhere walked two renderings of my father. One was tattered and worn, wearied by the accumulation of time, but not defeated by it. The other was clean and bright, a splendor in the growing shadow of the coming night. Dad's eyes were bright, and when he looked at me, I had no memory of ever finding them dimmed. His light, like an elixir in a glass-gallon jar forever tucked under his arm, was the very stuff that lights the stars. He was authentic. He was my dad. We climbed back into the truck, but I didn't start it up. I just sat there, probably a little dumbfounded for a minute. "What is it, Ransom?" Dad asked. "You know, Dad, about a month after I got to Europe, I was walking through a crowded fish market along the North Sea, and I noticed a curious fellow standing near a food trailer. He was already looking right at me when I found him. There was something in his eyes that I recognized, and to this day I can't say what. He was entirely disheveled, He had wrapped himself in a large army canvas tarpaulin and he'd modified by cutting out 2 ragged holes for his arms. He was visibly shivering in the damp of the morning, and I knew he was hungry. He smiled at me and then turned and slipped away into the crowd and was gone. There's nothing more to be said of that disheveled man, but for years after I found myself narrating into the space he held. I wrote a short story about it and imagined him receiving a hot bun loaded with fish and butter from the rotund man at the trailer fryer. And later, still, I wrote another story about the same disheveled man, only this time I approached him and offered him my coat. But none of those little stories counted, and as much as I've thought about that disheveled man, I still know nothing about him. He is an enigma. Yet he has remained with me all these years later. At some point, I convinced myself I'd simply seen a ghost. You told me once a long time ago, Dad, when Bill and I were down in the basement of the old house looking at that slide of your ghost by the Mediterranean, it's not so much what we see in this life, but rather what we choose to recognize in what we see that tells us who we really are. Mom took it a step further when she told me that your painting reminded her to look for what she couldn't see. The only thing I knew when I saw the disheveled man that morning was that he would remain in every frame of my life ever after, and he has. Whether he existed or not doesn't really matter because I've never stopped looking for him. But just a moment ago, when you looked at me out there, I pointed out the window toward the old white horse now sniffing at the big red apple. I saw him in you. Dad nodded. There aren't any ghosts, are there, Dad? No, son, just strange angels, he said. You're one of mine, I said. I didn't see Dad for 2 weeks, and then he called one evening in mid-October. It was a Thursday night, as I remember it, and the Saints were on TV. He told me to bring Rachel and the kids and their jerseys for the game at his apartment, and so we went. He looked terrible that night, exhausted beyond belief, and I was concerned, but he said just not to worry. His sugars were a bit out of whack and he needed a good sleep. He perked up during the game, and I made sure he was comfortable. I asked him if he wanted to come up to the house and stay for the night, but he told me he had to work at the airport in the morning, and it would be too hard for him to shuffle back and forth. I knew not to press, and I knew also that to worry in front of him would have been a wasted effort. I trusted his sense of things, just as I always had. Dad walked us down to our car and told Rachel and the kids he loved them, and then he said to me, I've got a new plane in mind, before shuffling back up the steps to his second-floor apartment. I heard him sing to himself as he entered into and crossed the threshold of his door, Hi diddly-dee, a pirate's life from me. Dad came home early from the airport on the 22nd of October, 2016, and called Rachel to tell her he wasn't feeling well. Rachel said he sounded disoriented and a little frightened. She immediately called the paramedics. Then she called me. Dad died before help arrived. He was 67. On November 2nd, 2016, the Salt Lake Tribune ran a full-page story on the front of its print edition of the paper detailing a multi-year expansion and plans for a new high-tech terminal at the Salt Lake City International Airport. Adjacent to the impressive rendering of the new and modern terminal to be, accentuated in bright, artful, stenciled color full of attractive and fit-looking people, was a grainy photograph of the then present-day Terminal 2 at the top end of Concourse C at the airport. The photograph was a long-view shot taken to frame the expanse of the terminal in what must have been late afternoon because the rich light pouring in from the large windows to the right produced a silhouette image of a man working a mop with all his solitary might. It was Dad. No mention of Carl Stryker was put in the caption because no one, save myself and Rachel and those who worked with Dad, would have readily known it was Carl in the photograph, but it was. I called the paper that day to inquire about the photograph, but couldn't get through to the staff photographer who took it. About a week later, I got a call back and was told the photo was taken on the 2nd of October, just the day after my last fly day with Dad. I bought several copies of that edition of the paper and carefully cut the photograph out and laminated it and then placed it firmly on the bottom of my computer monitor at my writing desk. The very next morning, I began writing my first novel about an airport cleaner. It was terribly hard to write, but I finished it after several years of struggling to figure out what it was I wanted to say, and through some of the most difficult times of my dying former career. But I finished the book and sent it out without the faintest idea if it was worth enough attention to get published. As you well know, Corrine, that book made its way to you. and you took a chance on me as a writer. As I look back on those last years with Dad, I think of just one image, an image which holds all of my memory and feeling and insight and love and courage and an ethic of work. The image of the silhouette of the man with the mop preserves the treasure I keep and consider as I write. I see Dad anew every morning and wonder about the thoughts he kept to himself as he labored under the shadow of the eave of that terminal, shining a floor for countless feet to walk upon. A floor certain to lose its luster, but a floor like so many others he prepared as a clean pathway forward toward flight. Upon the shadow of the face of that man who was my father, I am convinced I see him smiling. I finish telling my story, emerging from it as if rising out of a dream. Corrine is gently sleeping, her face in a calm repose. I sit back in the chair and for a moment consider the words I have spoken. I followed a thread of light across the broad course of my life, but even now, so much of it remains largely elusive to me. In time, I trust I will understand more and why. I wish I had known your father, Ransom, says Corrine as she opens her eyes. You have his light. You have his words. And what you speak and also write matters. You have so much yet to write about. You have the power to move more than anyone I know. Corrine raises her head a little and points to a small cup with a straw on the table at the side of her bed. I reach for it and hold it for her as she slowly sips. I'm sorry, Ransom, for leaving you. I'm afraid to face what we spend our lives preparing for. It's silly, really, this fear of death. Maybe that's why I've spent my life swimming in language. It always felt like the most human thing to do. Good words are never dead. They are always full of life. Daddy used to read to me when I was little, and even at the end, when he was too sick to read, I heard his voice and my own voice as I read to him. It was one of the purest I have known, and I long to hear it again. It's the only comfort I hold on to as I face the abyss. But now I have your story and the sound of your voice to take with me as well. Corrine gestures for another sip of water, and I give it to her. As she drinks, I look around this room where she has worked all these years, surrounded by her books, in the company of voices across all of mortal time. Here remain the living words of writers both living and dead. Their stories are of a fluency of language not easily come by, and granted indefinite leave to remain, so long as there are readers to read the words. In the coming hours, this remarkable woman will depart this life, and in that moment she too will become a bit of their mythology and of mine. Her voice will reside as an essence of that elusive melody of sound and the timbre of the language my heart most desires to be fluent with. It is a dance and a struggle, and most often an agony. But when I am uncertain of this sojourn, I know that the sound of these words from countless writers, and also the sound of the words of my father and my mother and my brother will continue to show the way forward. In the end, we will only remember what this life felt like as we leave it behind, but not before some of us leave a sentence or two as a marker to the memory of that feeling, and the hope that someone, somewhere, on down the line, will read it. We sit in silence for a time, and when I rise to leave, I know, just as Corrine knows, that this will be the last we see of each other. Sweet woman, you are so dear to me, I say. Thank you for the language. Thank you for showing me the way forward. Oh, Ransom, it's the other way around. Never forget that to live most fully is to write, but writing is only ever just a small support to really living, and maybe dying too. Write until the very end, and then you'll find rest. I rise from the chair and say farewell. As I approach the door, I hear Corrine call out, "Promise me, Ransom, you'll write the story you told me in these small hours." I turn and say, I promise. Part 2. Books mattered to Corrine. I asked her once, a long time ago, why she preferred not to write one herself. She didn't dismiss the question with a witty response, and neither did she avoid it. She paused and looked right at me and said simply, "I have a higher calling." I never took that response as being anything other than profoundly genuine. Corrine Jacqueline Clifton had no guile. She simply loved books, and she made it her life's work to ensure that the ones she nurtured into print mattered. To produce one book, as she regularly told me, was to do something wonderful in your life, and, as it so happens, I quite enjoy being in a place where I can produce a great many. As I consider Corrine, She understood precisely how exceptional and fleeting life is, and therefore she placed her talent into the hands of the writers she worked with to ensure that their stories found a permanence on the page. "Just call me Max," she'd say, when we were reviewing drafts or the galleys of one of my books, in reference to the fabled editor Max Perkins of the 20th century, who understood that the work always belonged to the author. Corinne revered this adage and preferred to work in the shadow, just at the edge of the bright light on the page. She didn't need anything more than to know that the book she edited, or, as she described it, whispered into being, would only be made better for having been graced by her most human eye. But all these years later, what remains most with me is not the profound articulation of her massive talent for ridding this writer of his sluggishness and his voice. It was her prescient knack for helping a writer she believed in to stay on that most human path and pay careful attention to the ragged and imperfect and fragile variety of mortality. The work of language was too important to her to waste on anything less than emphasizing the grace of life in plain sight. How often, she told me, do we choose not to see what is right there in front of us? She echoed what my parents had long before taught me. They were right. A human is only as good as his or her eyesight, and a writer of any merit must have the skill to put into words what is often so difficult to say. I am growing far too old now to continue on at the pace I have maintained for the better part of the latter half of my life. I don't know what time remains for me, and I don't want to spend much of it looking back. I have finally put on the page what I promised Corinne I would write, and I think that is enough. Usually I begin my writing in the evening now, whereas for years I wrote early in the morning. I suppose in either case it doesn't much matter, because when I begin to write, there are always stars over the red desert of the southern Utah sky. On nights when I look beyond to the Milky Way, I know I'm getting closer to understanding what I've spent so long learning to write. It's there, out beyond all comprehension, that I see the same silhouette of my father in shadow as he mops the floor under the eaves of a great hall where kings and queens walk amongst the stars. There I see my brother Bill flying a little airplane he has so masterfully crafted. And there also I see my wife Rachel, and I long to be beside her. I reach for her still. I see my mother Evelyn sitting at her writing desk under the painting of the Mediterranean Sea, where a ghost stands to the side of a sun-drenched boat and smiles. And beyond that, I think of so many other ghosts no longer here, but somehow still remain, those disheveled gentle men and women, whoever they may be. And though I will never know them all the way I wish I could, I have a sense for the sound of their voices, and those voices always carry. When I listen, I hear them. It was Corinne who heard the quality of the voice of my father and the sound of my own as a writer. She nurtured that voice and pointed the way forward into a life of language. Like Dad, she was one of my strange angels. She once told me, "Ransom, all you need is what you've got." She reminded me that the job was to be original, to be compelling in the lingual fluency of sight and sound and vision, and most of all, of heart. Not very many can see what you see, Ransom, but I can see it. I certainly feel it when I read what you've written. You remind me of things I've told myself never to forget, and for this reason I want to help you. Maybe one reader, or two, or possibly three, if we're really lucky, will read what you've written, and then they too will see for themselves what was always right there to see. That's always something. Dad advised me to walk in a stride as if measuring my height from the ceiling down rather than from the floor up. I came to know that it was like what it was like to be 8 feet tall, and maybe now I understand how the composition in his words gave me something to listen for in my own. I became a writer, but he never got to be a painter, not in the way he deserved. This book is as much his hymn as it is mine. And my hymn, I hope, will carry out into the great wide open space of the stars over this Utah desert to greet Dad wherever he might be. I imagine soon I will know for myself. I trust my voice, blended with his, will carry on and never cease to soar well beyond the expanse of this far too short and insignificant time. Earlier this evening, I stood on the deck of my home here in Springdale, Utah, and watched the orange of the sun sear its amber glow into the heavy red rock. And just at the point where the two met, that light, for an instant, pulsed white. I thought of a small, curious boy standing in front of a tall bookshelf in the green hallway of his Grammy's home in Pleasant Grove. And there, in the light of morning, a similar pulse of white refracted itself off the glass of the window above South Street, and pulsed with the same intense flash. That little boy and this old man are one. Both are joined by the words fin. Epilogue. The bright light of an astoundingly beautiful morning streams through the broad length of continuous glass framing the majestic Wasatch Mountains along the line of Concourse A of the Salt Lake City International Airport. The towering face of those mountains is now showing intermittent flourishes of reds and yellows and oranges in the fall of this year. A young man reads news of the death of a writer he has read. The New York Times. Ransom Carl Stryker, novelist, dies at 85. October 9, 2059. Ransom Carl Stryker, the novelist from the Mountain West who gave melodic voice to those often in the shadows and whose writing featured piercing language with a deft skill of narrative insight, died yesterday at his home near Zion, Utah. He was 85. The cause was cardiac arrest. In recent years, he had slowed a bit, but persisted to write nearly every day, and just last year published his 14th book, a spare memoir entitled In These Small Hours. That book, as he described it, was a real-life compendium to his first novel, The Airport Cleaner, which was published when he was 49 in 2023. In spite of his late start as a novelist, he proved to be consistent and over time prolific in his creativity. Along the way, Mr. Stryker became one of the most endearing writers in contemporary American letters. Critics and readers alike considered Stryker as a writer in possession of a unique power. He conveyed a mood of considerable resonance and found the means to write about topics usually hard to depict in the smallest moments of everyday living. His language soared highest in these spare, usually ignored spaces. In 2041, after the publication of his seventh novel, he told an audience about a particular scene in one of his favorite films by the late director Martin Scorsese. Raging Bull came out when I was just a little boy, he said. I wouldn't actually see the film until I was much older, possibly 18 or 19 in my memory. But I'll never forget the influence of one very poignant scene when De Niro's character reaches through a chain-link fence and shakes the pinky finger of a girl he is talking to. That small, unnoticeable touch meant a lot to me. And I think in a lot of ways, it's the same sort of thing I attempt to do when I write. Mr. Stryker's novels are redolent with these small touches of humanity. The flourishes he offered have become one of the trademarks of his craft as both a novelist as well as an essayist. He would spend the next 4 decades of his life making up for the first 4 that it took just to get started as a writer. I can't explain it, but though I studied literature as an undergraduate at Southern Utah University, I wouldn't seriously begin writing until I was 40. Life just got in the way, I guess. But through all the years, from my earliest memories to this present moment, I have always been a voracious and omnivorous reader. It was only a matter of time before I would start crafting sentences of my own, he said in 2055. Mr. Stryker's luck changed after penning a short novel about an airport cleaner that was set in his native state of Utah and centers around the Salt Lake City airport. His father, towards the end of his life, got a job cleaning floors and restrooms in the terminals there. The novel, as he described it, as a hymn to fathers and sons, as well as a powerful story of language and the gift of finding oneself in the quiet dilemmas we all must face, and usually alone. The book found its way serendipitously onto the desk of the late editor, Miss Corinne Jacqueline Clifton at Doubleday Knopf. She was intrigued, and it was published the following year. As this young man finishes reading the obituary, a cleaner in yellow pushing a utility cart passes by unnoticed on his way to the other end of the terminal. Here in this clean, well-lighted place, human lives intersect in a passage of arrivals and departures, a continuous ebb and flow of movement and of language and countless untold stories linking every beating heart into one interconnected narrative. A young woman walks alone towards a gate she is soon to enter into and depart from. She has a little time yet. She slows her pace and then stops and looks around and notices a man with a mop standing in the shadow of the broad terminal just ahead of her. She watches him work for a while and considers the thoughts he keeps. The floor upon which he stands shimmers. After a while, he stops and looks up and sees this young woman smiling at him. He smiles back and then returns to his work. She moves forward into the promise of a new day, where beyond this one small hour, the rest of her life is waiting. Thank you for being with me here in these small hours.